theory and practice, here with Andrea Henderson, one of our favorite Domo employees. And I say favorite because she was kind enough to be one of our guest speakers at our in-person user group that we had just a few months ago. Andrea, it's so great to see you again. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here.
I will just mention and call out. There's some folks that are probably watching and going, "What are these? What are these fancy graphics happening all over the screen?" It might just be easier for me to do that. The one up top is the QR code that will make it super easy for you to register for Domopalooza. Multiply your impact. That registration page is live, so you can click that QR code. And obviously, this is community content, so why not promote our dojo in itself? Our community forums. You can join all your peers in conversation at the QR code down below. So we're kind of highlighting those, kind of a fancy graphic. We were testing this out the other day, and I think my good friend Anna Yardley said, "Eddie, you're not pointing in the right direction." And she's absolutely right. So I'm just going to stop using my hands. So we're really excited to have you, Andrea. Obviously, this session's super important. We want to talk about partitioning. I know that when we asked, what kind of content would be provided today, we just want to give some folks a summary. But we want to make sure that you are building effective and robust data pipelines and all of this data that you're creating and gathering with this increased demand for low data latency. And you're here to tell us how that's going to be accomplished. So I'm really excited to see you focus on what that looks like. We're going to talk about theory. We're going to talk about tactical implementation. I am just thrilled that you were able to join us and that you accepted the invite to come on to the live stream. It can be a little unnerving at times to try something like this new. And you were fantastic at our user group. I even put in our community channels the other day that backed by popular demand, because everybody talks about Andrea's session from that user group. So thank you so much for being here and joining us, and excited for you to get started. But before we do that, the Q&A is super important. We want to make sure you're involved and engaged in this session. So do your best to make those comments, suggestions, questions. All of those can happen in the live chat. And again, I'm using my fingers to point to things. Not quite sure if they're going the right direction, whether it's below, to the side. There is a live chat or comment section wherever you are watching this content. Be sure to give us a shout or give Andrea some great tips and pointers on just being awesome, because that's what we're here for. We're excited to hear all that love she gets during the session. So Andrea, take it away. Partitioning, you're in charge. I'm turning it over to you. Super excited to have you. Thanks again for joining us.
Great. Thank you, Eddie. I could definitely use those comments about how to be awesome. So, keep those coming. So we can flip over. I do have some slides that I want to go over. But mostly I'm just super excited to be here today. I love interacting with our customers. You guys are the best. And I am super passionate about data pipelines and especially about partitioning. It's my favorite feature. People have said it is now my entire personality, which I will just own. My personality is partitioning now. So I want to intro you a little bit to what I mean when I'm talking about partitioning. And then we can dive into some examples.
Andrea, real quick.
Sure.
Yeah, real quick, I'm going to say absolutely 100%. I did want to call this out. Some of the folks that are watching asked for a recording. So these sessions are always recorded on the platforms we push to, whether you're watching on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter. They're already uploaded the moment that we end the session, which makes them super cool. So absolutely 100% this will be available. We obviously put them on the community when they're finished, but I just wanted to call that out before we got started. I'll go ahead and share your screen now. I'll get out of the way and stop interrupting the awesomeness of Andrea today. Apologies.
Thanks, Eddie. All right. So first, I want to dive into a little bit about what partitioning is as a theory so that we all have a similar understanding of it. I'll talk a little bit about where it's available in the Domo product, use cases specifically for which you might want to use partitioning, and then we can dive directly into the Domo interface, and I'll show you how it looks, how it feels, how you might want to use it, and I will go ahead and answer questions that you might have as we go, or at the end. So feel free to throw them out there. So talking about partitioning, what is partitioning as a concept? At the most basic, partitioning is a data storage strategy in which data are subset by a partition key tag. So parts of data are subset by this key tag that you specify, either at ingest or in your transformation. This means that data stored in this way will only, or that Domo knows when data is stored in this way to only load and process data that needs to be loaded and processed, and you are never in a situation where you are having to do a full replace on your data or having to create a process in which you are reprocessing huge amounts of data that do not need to be reprocessed. So, for example, here you'll see on the right hand side, there's a data set that you have that already exists, has partitions 1 through 4 in it. You have new data that's being ingested with partitions 3 and 5 defined. Partition 3 replaces partition 3 existing in your data set. Partition 5 is appended. So it is a similar data storage and update strategy to update or upsert or insert, but it is working with blocks of data. Now, what do I mean when I'm talking about blocks of data? It can sometimes help people if we talk about this from the concept of an encyclopedia. So I'm probably aging myself a little bit here, but think back to your parents' bookshelves or your grandparents' bookshelves on which they had that big 26 volume encyclopedia where, and you can think about a data set that's been partitioned like a shelf of encyclopedias where each partition is a book from A to Z. Now, when you need to update information in one of the books, you would take the entire book off the shelf, update the information, and replace the entire book. If you tried to just update a page or two and then take the book off the shelf and replace that book with the page or two that you updated, you would have an incomplete partition and an incomplete data set. So if you obviously if you make changes to a large number of pages and you're pulling out and replacing a lot of books at once, you're losing the utility, the efficiency of partitioning, and you might as well just be doing a full replace of your whole data set. People say, what if I just had one big book and I took out individual pages and cut and paste? Like, yes, but then you're thinking about upsert more than partitioning, and upsert is definitely more resource intensive than partitioning is. So why would you want to think about designing partitioning into your pipeline? Probably the key reason that customers come to this is because it can reduce the end-to-end latency of your pipeline because you're only processing data that needs to be processed. It is more efficient, and that reduces the end-to-end runtime of your pipelines. It also is more scalable because of this. And it also improves the robustness of your pipeline. So it's more error tolerant because you do not have to deal with potentially duplicating data by running data through your pipeline. You can do things like run a rolling window of days through your data and make sure that that data can replace data that already exists or append new data. Previously to now, this was available at ingest within Domo. You can do it through Workbench. You can use the Domo CLI tool to set up partition pipelines. Some of our connectors have partitioning available. Now we have it available in the transform layer in Magic 2. It's currently in a beta. If after this conversation you are interested in having that turned on, you can reach out to your account team and they can work on getting that beta turned on for you. It is not a premium feature. It will become part of the core product when it is in GA. We're just, we have a little bit of closed beta right now as we're making sure that people completely understand how to use the beta before they get it integrated into their production pipelines. So potential use cases for partitioning and how you might implement them. One use case would be if your data has a curing period. I know a lot of social media data has a curing period, like Facebook, it's 7 days until the data is completely cured or considered ready to use. So in the case where your data has a curing period, previously, if you wanted to be able to bring that data into Domo and process it in your downstream pipeline, you would have to create a recursive data flow in which you had to feed back in your historical data set every time into your data flow in order to process, deduplicate, and generate that new updated output data set. With partitioning, you have the option of just loading in that rolling 7-day window, bringing it into your data flow, in which case you would then partition on date, and then that data is either inserted or appended into your partitioned data set. It is much more performant because you never have to reprocess all of your old historical data, but you get to keep that big historical data set there that you like to perform all of your historical trending on. Another use case we see frequently is when you want to create a daily snapshot. So in this use case, um, this one always felt particularly wasteful to me, and I'm so grateful that we now have this ability to create snapshots that does not require so much needless reprocessing of data. So in this use case, previously, in order to create a daily snapshot, so you wanted to create, today I talked to someone who wanted to create a daily sales inventory snapshot. What they're doing currently is they bring in their daily data into a Magic ETL flow, and they also bring in their whole historical data set of years and years of data, and they append that new row to, or that new set of data to their historical data and output all that data. And it's taken them like 10 hours to do. With partitioning, once you set up the historical data set so that it is partitioned, you can bring in just that current day and assign it its partition column, the partition tag, and then it will append to your output data set. You never have to feed back in the historical data. You never have to touch the historical data. It will exist. It doesn't need to be written back out. The runtime end to end is significantly reduced. The data architect in me feels the need to call out that this is kind of a brittle pipeline design because you're relying upon the current day's data to always run reliably. In this use case, if it would be a tragedy if you lose a single day of data, I would recommend building in like a 3-day rolling window or something to make sure that you never miss a day of data. Another case in which you might want to think about partitioning, even if your data is not particularly large, or even if you're not necessarily doing a recursive data flow, is if you ever have cases where you need to restate historical data. If your output data set of your data flow is partitioned, you can very easily make surgical updates to that data without having to feed it all back in and try to deduplicate and remove, the current day's data or the corrupted data and replace with the new data. You can just use the subset processing feature, which is part of the partitioning feature in Magic, to select the day that you want to bring in, and then only that day will be processed and updated in your output data set. And then finally, another use case for which you might want to look at partitioning in Magic is if you have a recursive data flow that you want to get rid of. Anyone who's dealt with recursive data flows knows that they're kind of brittle. It can be a nightmare to repair them. They require a ton of needless reprocessing of data. So if your data lends itself to partitioning, if you can bring in, days at a time, um, that can be a way that you can replace your recursive data flows. In cases where you have a recursive data flow set up in a more upsert pattern where you are using a unique identifier row by row, that use case is not yet covered within Magic, but it is coming. It's just those types of recursive data flows are not available to be replaced right now. So talking about this more specifically in Magic, there is a companion feature that goes along with it. I mentioned it a second ago called subset processing, or maybe data selection is how it's being termed in the interface, that basically gives you the ability to take metadata, information that Domo knows about your input data sets, and use that information to be selective about what data is brought into your Domo Magic data flow. Now, a lot of people will say, oh, great, I want to be able to filter on this column that has companies, and I want to just filter to this company or this product or whatever. I get it. That is not how this feature works. This feature operates on metadata about your data, not on data that exists within your data set. So metadata that Domo could know about your data, for example, would be when the data was loaded to Domo. It would know information if your data was already loaded with partitions, like if you had used partitioning in a connector when you were loading your data. Magic knows that information about your input data set and can use that information in the subset processing um, tile in order, or the subset processing settings in order to restrict the data that is brought into your Magic data flow. So I have a lot of screenshots here and things, but I would much rather just hop into the tool and have a look at some examples. Um, Eddie, I don't know if there are questions or anything yet that I should dive
Yeah,
into.
I always say it's a good session when no one has questions. So no specific questions so far.
Okay,
We are running through it smooth. So if you want to bounce over to the platform and show off a little bit of that, it'd be great. But no specific questions at this time. And if you do have
okay,
questions, put them in the live chat in the comment section. We'll be happy to run through those during the session. So thanks, Andrea.
great, great. Okay, so when we're looking at just the interface in general, so we're here in just the data flow configuration interface. When you look at the data sets that are part of this data flow, you'll see my input data set runs every day. It consists of, just a couple hundred rows, and the output data set is almost 24,000 rows. When you look at the history, anybody who's been, building data flows in Domo for a while would expect that with this snapshot, with this recursive data flow that I would normally have to build in order to build the snapshot data flow, it should be showing not only the 156 rows being ingested every day, but it should also show the 24,000 rows, because I would have to re-ingest those in order to update them. And then it would show the output of, 24,000 rows. So already this is looking like, okay, interesting. Domo is only reading and processing this many rows. Domo is only outputting this many rows, even though my output data set is 24,000. How's this happening? So going into the data flow itself, I will show you a couple things. So on the input tile, here is where you configure the subset processing. Um, when you look here to the right of where you're choosing your data set, you see this data selection dropdown, which is new. Previously, your only option was you were loading all rows from the data set, which is great. You can still do that. You also have the ability to just load new data that has been loaded to that input data set since the data flow last ran, or you can choose specific uploads or partitions. When you choose specific uploads or partitions, there's this section of your configuration screen in which you can use a couple of different options. There is information about when your data was processed in Domo, which is what I'm using in this case. I'm just setting up a basic snapshot. So I want to say I want data that was processed in the last one day, because I'm taking a daily snapshot of the weather, which is too cold here in Draper, by the way. It's freezing. So when you choose when data is processed, you can make any type of date selection that you might guess you could make. You can choose last number of, days, hours, weeks, months. You can choose between, you can give it a range, you can choose current day, etc. As you're playing around with these, you'll notice that there will be changes made to this little section up here that says, my selection here has chosen one of one uploads and 156 rows. And when I go to view, it shows me the time that the rows were uploaded, how many rows it encompasses, and if my input was partitioned, it would show me the partition name. I'll show you an example in just a second, if we have time and Eddie doesn't pull me off stage with the cane, where we can use a custom expression, and that gets really fun. That gives a lot of interesting opportunities. But moving over to look at the partition feature here, it is configured on the output data set. So previously, your only option was to replace. Now you have the ability to either just add new rows or to partition your output. And this does ask for information from a column in your data set. So you can choose any column in your data set that has the partition that you want to use. This is a good time to talk about what makes a good partition. I always say a good partition is one that is sufficiently high enough level granularity that it takes advantage of the performance benefits with partitioning, and that it encompasses enough of a block of your data that when you are operating in that fashion, you are not touching a lot of different blocks of data at once. However, you want it to be granular enough that it's useful to you. A lot of customers will not find it useful to have a partition at a month level, per se, because then they would have to replace full blocks of months at a time, and that wouldn't be useful to them in their business process. A lot of customers find it very useful to partition at a day level. And that is generally what I try to do. Some customers find that they need to partition at something like a company in a day level or a product in a day level. So you can partition on compound fields, but you have to concatenate them because you can only select one column for your partition. In my case, in my data set, I don't have a good date column that I want to use. I have a couple timestamps, but this is a snapshot that I'm creating. So basically what I want to do is just assign today's date to every one of these rows. So I go in here and create it using a formula, a column that I'm just calling partition date that just has the current date. And this assigns the current date as partition tag to every one of these rows. And then in my output, I say my partition column is this partition date that I created, and then I run and save my data flow. Looking here on the output, you'll see this new tab here of partitions, and it'll show you how many partitions and what the names are and how many rows exist within your data set. So you'll see the date for the rows that were uploaded into the partition name, and the number of rows. This has been running for quite some time. So, I have a number of partitions on this data set. So that's the basics of the interface. Looking at a more complex use case, I want to be able to have a partitioned input to my Magic data flow because I want to leverage some of what um, subset processing allows. So here I'm just taking my data set and I'm just running it through a straight Magic flow to add a partition. I don't know that I would recommend this as a best practice, although it definitely works if your goal is to have a data set in your instance that is not partitioned become a partitioned data set. You can run it through a Magic flow and assign the partition column. In this case, I'm taking the date of the start time, and then this output data set will be a partitioned data set. I'm using that as an input here to a downstream data flow. Um, Once you define a partition in Domo knows about that partition everywhere within the platform. So even though I partition this upstream and I assign the partition tags to it, Domo knows about those tags here downstream in this data flow. In this case, I'm choosing, specific uploads or partitions, and I'm using this custom expression. And this is where it gets really interesting because you have the ability to operate on the partition metadata that Domo knows about your input data set. So because my partition name is a date, I can use date functions on it. And basically, I'm just creating a filter here. So I'm saying when my partition name is greater than or equal to this expression, then it will be brought into Domo. Otherwise, or then it will be brought into this data flow. Otherwise, it will not. Um, and the expression that we are creating here is telling how many number of days of partitions the the filter should look for in deciding, or it should look for when bringing in partitions, and we're basing it on what the current day of the month is. So in this case, I'm saying if the current day of the month is the first, bring in 365 partitions, otherwise bring in 30. This can come into play when you have a situation where you have a data flow that you want to run multiple times a day, but it takes a couple of hours to run and you don't really need all of that data updated intraday. So you might say, if it's any of these hours except for midnight, run just, the last week. Otherwise, at midnight, run the full year of data. So it gives you a lot of robust scheduling options. Downstream here, I'm just, joining in a calendar dimension. I'm just, pretend I'm doing something interesting in my data flow, and then I am partitioning out. A couple of things to note. There are some limitations per data set and per execution. You're limited to 1,500 partitions per data set. So if you're partitioning at a day level, that's between 4 and 5 years worth of data. If you are partitioning at a level that's more granular than that, you're going to need to think strategically about how much data you can keep in a given data set if you are planning to partition it. The 1,500 per execution is kind of immaterial when the total limit is 1,500 per data set, but that may change in the future. There may be more available per data set, and it might stay at 1,500 per execution. So just keeping an eye on that. Per execution means per time that the data flow is run. Just to underscore, again, when you load data for a partition, the data that is loaded for that partition replaces all current data for that partition. So if you have your data partitioned at a month level and you need to update several days of data within that month, you would need to load in the entire month, including those changed days, or else you would end up with a partial month in your output data set. And then finally, there's not a way to delete partitions through the interface, although that is the number one thing that people ask me when I'm talking to them about partitions in Magic, and they they are working on it. It is a high priority item for them. So Eddie, that is the information that I have available. Are there questions? Are there places people want to dive deeper?
Not so far, but we do welcome those in the comments in the chat section to the right-hand side or down below, depending on where you're at. It's always a different spot. Andrea has been absolutely fantastic. If you don't have any questions or comment suggestions, tell her how awesome she was in those same spaces, because it was fantastic, as it always is when she's able to share her knowledge. It's been fantastic. So we started these a couple weeks ago. We do them every Tuesday and Thursday. So just the folks that are watching, every Tuesday and Thursdays, we do Tuesday at 4:30 Eastern, and we do Thursday at 12:30 Eastern time, both in the PM. Trying to do that to kind of do all of these fancy things with time zones to make sure people show up and can be interactive. We have got a lot of love coming from Andrea. It is happening. Hold on just a second, Andrea. Let me get you moved over here. Look at us. Let's not forget the two fancy QR codes, but also Eric, sorry, not Erica. Eric from YouTube says thanks. Kunal here says the session is fantastic. Lots of love for you, as always. Thank you so much for being here. We really do appreciate it.
Thanks, Eddie.
All right, we are going to end this stream and session. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We appreciate it. Ben, our good friend Ben, says you're the best. Might be time to ask for a raise, Andrea. All right, we'll see you later. We're out of here. Thanks, everybody, for watching. We can't wait for the next one. The next one will be on Thursday. And in fact, you may see this guy in the comment section. You may actually see him on the next live stream. Might be teasing that one. We're going to talk a little bit of Chat GPT. Hot topic. I know it's super hot, so we're excited to get him and some folks from his team on. We're going to be promoting that session, obviously, all week on social. Make sure you tune in. If you need questions answered, the dojo, QR code down below. Up top, you want to go to our customer event, Domopalooza. You can register for that virtually. Thanks again, everybody. We'll see you on the next one.